stay one step ahead of its enemies. Unlike many traitors, Philby was not motivated by money. Pause. He was driven by ideology. Pause. Recruited years earlier while studying at Cambridge, he believed communism was the future of humanity. By the time World War II ended, he had already embedded himself deep within Western intelligence. Pause. And as the Cold War began, his value to the Soviet Union became priceless. Philby warned Moscow about Western plans to weaken Soviet influence in Eastern Europe. Pause. Entire missions failed before they even began. Pause. Resistance groups were exposed. Pause. Agents were arrested. Many were never seen again. Long pause. Western leaders could not understand why their operations kept collapsing. Pause. The reason was sitting among them. Perhaps the most disturbing part of Philby's story is how long he escaped detection. Pause. Despite growing suspicions, investigations were delayed, softened, or ignored. Pause. Philby used charm, confidence, and a culture of trust inside British intelligence to protect himself. Pause. Every year he remained undetected allowed the Soviet Union to strengthen its control over half of Europe. By the time Philby finally defected to Moscow in 1963, the damage was irreversible. Pause. The Cold War world had already taken shape. Pause. Eastern Europe was firmly under Soviet control. Pause. Intelligence agencies no longer trusted even their closest allies. Pause. Paranoia had become official policy. Philby spent the rest of his life in the Soviet Union. Pause. He received little fame, little comfort, and no public glory. Pause. To some, he was a traitor. Pause. To others, a master spy. Pause. But to history, he was largely forgotten. Yet his legacy is still alive. Pause. The global intelligence systems we see today, the secrecy, the leaks, the silent wars between nations, all trace back to figures like Kim Philby. Pause. He proved that one individual, armed only with access and patience, could change the fate of nations. History remembers battles, presidents, and treaties. Pause. But sometimes, the most powerful forces are the ones we never see. The forgotten spy who shaped the post-World War II world reminds us of a chilling truth. The future of humanity can be changed by a single person, if no one is watching. Even after Kim Philby disappeared behind the Iron Curtain, the shockwaves of his betrayal continue to spread across the intelligence world. Western agencies were forced to confront a terrifying reality. If someone so trusted could deceive them for decades, then no one was truly beyond suspicion. Careers were destroyed, friendships ended, and entire departments were restructured. The fear Philby left behind became a weapon of its own, silently weakening cooperation between allies that in Britain. The damage was especially deep. MI6's reputation was shattered, not by a foreign enemy, but from within. Investigations revealed that Philby had not acted alone. He was part of a wider network, later known as the Cambridge Five, elite men educated at the highest levels, trusted precisely because of their background. This revelation exposed a painful truth. Intelligence failures were not always the result of poor technology or lack of resources, but of misplaced trust and human blindness. Across the Atlantic, American intelligence agencies reacted with anger and paranoia. Information sharing between the United States and Britain slowed dramatically. Files were locked away. Operations became compartmentalized. The world of espionage shifted from cooperation to caution. This hesitation allowed the Soviet Union to maneuver more aggressively, exploiting Western mistrust to expand its influence in Asia, Africa, and Latin America during the following decades. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Philby discovered that life on the winning side of history was not what he had imagined. Though he was welcomed as a hero by Soviet intelligence, he lived under constant surveillance. The very system he had served with absolute loyalty did not fully trust him. His days were filled with lectures, interviews, and propaganda appearances, but his nights were often spent in isolation. The spy who had shaped the world was now trapped inside it. As years passed, Philby watched from afar as global crises unfolded. The Cuban Missile Crisis, proxy wars in Vietnam and Afghanistan, nuclear standoff that brought humanity to the edge of annihilation. Many of these events followed fault lines created in the immediate aftermath of World War II. Borders drawn, alliances formed, and suspicions hardened during those early Cold War years, all influenced by intelligence victories and failures that Philby had helped engineer. What makes Philby's story truly unsettling is not just what he did, but how easily it could happen again. Intelligence agencies today rely on technology, surveillance, and algorithms, yet they are still built on human trust. One clearance approval, one overlooked warning, one person in the right position. The lessons of Philby's betrayal remain painfully relevant in a world where cyber espionage and digital leaks have replaced coded messages and secret meetings. History rarely pauses to examine the men who worked in silence. Kim Philby did not command armies or lead nations. He left no monuments, no speeches, no public legacy. And yet, his fingerprints remain on the structure of modern geopolitics. Every intelligence alliance shaped by suspicion, every covert operation planned in secrecy, and every silent conflict fought in shadows carries echoes of his actions in the end, Philby's life raises an uncomfortable question. Was he a villain who betrayed his country, or a believer who sacrificed everything for an idea? Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. History does not deal in absolutes. It deals in consequences. And the consequences of one forgotten spy continue to shape the balance of power long after the guns of World War II fell silent. The world often remembers its heroes in statues and ceremonies. But the architects of the modern age often remain invisible, hidden in classified files, buried in sealed archives. Their stories whispered rather than spoken. Kim Philby was one of them, a shadow that moved nations, then vanished. And as long as nations compete for power, secrets will matter. As long as secrets matter, spies will exist. And somewhere, even now, another forgotten name may already be shaping the future, while no one is watching. Long after Kim Philby's death in 1988, historians began reopening sealed files and classified archives. Slowly, a clearer picture emerged, not just of what Philby had done, but of how close the world had come to a very different future. Some operations he sabotaged were designed to prevent the spread of authoritarian control. Others aimed to protect fragile democracies in their infancy. When those plans failed, the political vacuum they left behind was quickly filled, shaping regimes that still exist today. In Eastern Europe, entire generations grew up behind borders that might see have hardened had early Cold War intelligence played out differently. The Iron Curtain was not built overnight. It was reinforced by quiet failures, leaked strategies, and lost opportunities. Philby did not create the Cold War, but he helped lock it into place at its most critical moment. Timing, more than ideology, gave his actions their lasting power. What makes Philby's influence so difficult to measure is that success in espionage is often invisible. When a mission fails quietly, history rarely records the reason. There are no public inquiries, no memorials, no headlines. Only patterns emerge later. Repeated defeats, strange coincidences, and enemies who always seem prepared. For decades, those patterns were dismissed as bad luck. In reality, they were fingerprints left behind by a single source. Inside intelligence agencies, Philby's name became a warning rather than a memory. New recruits were trained using his case as an example of what could go wrong when loyalty is assumed rather than verified. Psychological screening, background checks, and internal surveillance increased worldwide. Trust became conditional. Friendship became a liability. The human cost of this shift was enormous, but the alternative, another Philby, was considered far worse. Philby himself struggled with the weight of his choices. Friends who had trusted him were disgraced or imprisoned. Some never recovered. Though he rarely spoke of guilt in public, those who knew him in Moscow described a man haunted by contradictions. He had devoted his life to a cause, yet lived long enough to see that cause fracture, compromise, and betray its own ideals. The world he helped shape did not resemble the future he once believed in as the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. Only a few years after Philby's death, the irony became impossible to ignore. The empire he had risked everything to protect fell without a final war. Borders shifted again. Alliances dissolved. A new world order emerged, one built not on ideology, but on economics and influence. And yet, the habits of secrecy, distrust, and covert struggle remained firmly in place. Today, modern espionage looks different on the surface. Satellites watch from space. Data travels faster than thought. Cyber warfare replaces coded telegrams. But at its core, the game is unchanged. Information still decides outcomes. Access still creates power. And human beings, flawed, ideological, ambitious, remain the weakest and most powerful link in every intelligence system. Kim Philby's story is not just history. It is a warning, a reminder that the fate of nations can hinge on personal beliefs hidden behind professional masks. That loyalty is not guaranteed by rank or reputation, and that the most decisive battles of any era may never be visible to the public eye. The world continues to turn, shaped by agreements signed in daylight and betrayals carried out in darkness. Somewhere, files are being copied, trust is being earned, and futures are being quietly rewritten, because history is not only made by those who stand in the spotlight. It is also shaped by those who remain unseen, working patiently, silently, and decisively in the shadows. The true power of espionage lies not in dramatic assassinations or explosive revelations, but in patience. Kim Philby understood this better than most. He did not rush. He did not seek attention. He waited, listened, observed, and quietly positioned himself where decisions were made. This patience allowed him to influence events not through force, but through timing. A delayed warning, a misplaced document, a subtle suggestion at the right moment. In intelligence work, these small actions often carry consequences far greater than any public act of aggression. During the late 1940s, as Europe fractured into ideological camps, intelligence agencies became architects of the future. They advised governments on whom to trust, which movements to support, and which leaders posed threats. Philby's influence during this period cannot be overstated. As a senior intelligence figure, his assessments shaped how the West interpreted Soviet intentions. When he downplayed threats, Western vigilance weakened. When he exaggerated risks elsewhere, attention was diverted. This manipulation of perception became one of his most effective tools. One of the least discussed consequences of Philby's actions was the loss of alternative futures. History often presents outcomes as inevitable, but many post-World War II developments were not predetermined. Several Eastern European nations stood at political crossroads after the war. Their futures were undecided, their populations exhausted, their institutions fragile. Intelligence support could have strengthened democratic movements or at least delayed authoritarian consolidation. Instead, compromised operations failed repeatedly, allowing Soviet influence to solidify with minimal resistance. In countries like Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Poland, early opposition networks were quietly dismantled. Leaders disappeared. Movements collapsed. From the outside, these developments appeared to be organic political shifts. Only later did historians realize how many of these failures traced back to leaked intelligence. Philby never issued orders, never signed decrees. Yet his information cleared the path for regimes that would rule millions for generations. The psychological impact on Western intelligence was equally profound. Once Philby's betrayal was confirmed, agencies began questioning not only their procedures, but their own identities. Intelligence work had long relied on social class, education, and personal reputation as indicators of trustworthiness. Philby shattered that illusion. He was not an outsider. He was not desperate or marginalized. He was exactly what the system valued most. This realization forced intelligence services to confront uncomfortable truths about bias, privilege, and vulnerability. As internal trust eroded, intelligence culture shifted. Surveillance turned inward. Colleagues watched colleagues. Loyalty tests multiplied. While this reduced some risks, it also stifled creativity and cooperation. Fear replaced confidence. In attempting to prevent another Philby, agencies sometimes weaken themselves. The Cold War intelligence environment became a world of locked doors and fragmented knowledge, where even allies shared information reluctantly. Philby's personal relationships added another layer of tragedy to his story. Many of his closest friends were intelligence officers who trusted him completely. Some defended him publicly even as evidence mounted. When the truth emerged, these individuals faced humiliation, professional ruin, and lifelong guilt. Philby's betrayal was not abstract. It destroyed real lives. The quiet devastation left behind rarely appears in historical summaries, yet represents one of the most human consequences of espionage. In Moscow, Philby's existence became increasingly symbolic. He was paraded as proof of Soviet superiority, yet never fully embraced. Defectors are valuable, but they are also reminders of betrayal. If Philby could deceive his own country so thoroughly, could he ever be fully trusted? This contradiction followed him until the end of his life. The spy who lived by secrecy died surrounded by it. As the Cold War matured, Intelligence failures on both sides escalated tensions dangerously. Misinterpretations nearly triggered nuclear catastrophe on multiple occasions. The Cuban Missile Crisis stands as the most famous example, but it was not unique. Behind every near miss were analysts interpreting incomplete information, shaped by decades of institutional fear and suspicion. The shadow of earlier betrayals like Philby's influenced how risks were calculated and how aggressively threats were perceived. The collapse of the Soviet Union revealed yet another layer of irony. Archives opened, files were studied, analysts discovered that many Western fears had been exaggerated, while others had been dangerously underestimated. The Cold War world had been built on distorted perceptions, some accidental, some deliberate. Philby's actions were only one thread in this vast web, but they were woven at a moment when the fabric of global order was still fragile. Modern historians now view Philby less as an isolated villain and more as a symptom of a deeper conflict. The post-World War II world was not simply divided by ideology, but by trauma. Entire populations had lived through destruction on an unprecedented scale. Fear drove decisions. Certainty was rare. In such an environment, those who claimed ideological clarity, like Philby, found opportunity. His betrayal thrived in a world desperate for belief. Today's geopolitical landscape still carries echoes of those early Cold War decisions. NATO expansion, Russian distrust of the West, intelligence rivalries, proxy conflicts, all trace roots to the immediate post-war years. While it would be simplistic to blame one man for such vast outcomes, it would be equally wrong to ignore how individual actions influence collective paths. History is not only shaped by structures, but by moments, and by those who quietly control them. Philby's story also forces us to reconsider the nature of loyalty. Is loyalty owed to a nation, a government, an ideology, or a personal moral code? Philby believed he was serving humanity by supporting communism. His critics see only betrayal. Between these views lies a difficult truth. Intelligence work often exists in moral gray zones where clarity is rare and consequences are unpredictable. As technology advances, the methods change, but the dilemma remains. Today's spies may never meet their handlers in dark alleys or exchange coded letters. Yet the stakes are higher than ever. Digital breaches can destabilize economies. Leaked intelligence can alter elections. The tools are new, but the principle Philby demonstrated still holds. Access equals power. Perhaps the most unsettling lesson of Philby's life is how invisible influence truly works. The most decisive actors are often those whose names never appear in headlines. They do not announce their victories. They leave behind patterns, not proof. By the time their impact becomes clear, the moment for change is long past. History will continue to uncover forgotten figures like Philby. As archives open and narratives shift, new shadows will emerge. Each will remind us that the story of the modern world is not only written in treaties and wars, but in trust gained, secrets shared, and choices made in silence. And somewhere, right now, in an office, a database, or a secure room with no windows, another individual may be making decisions that future generations will struggle to understand. Not with weapons, not with speeches, but with information. Because the most powerful forces in history rarely announce themselves. They operate quietly, patiently, and by the time the world notices, the future has already been decided. As historians dug deeper into the intelligence archives of the Cold War, a disturbing realization began to surface. Kim Philby was not simply exploiting weaknesses in the system. He was revealing how fragile the system truly was. Intelligence agencies liked to believe they operated with precision and control, yet Philby proved that belief itself could be weaponized. By behaving exactly as expected, he became invisible. His success was not based on brilliance alone, but on predictability. He understood what loyalty was supposed to look like, and he performed it flawlessly. This realization forced a painful reckoning within intelligence communities worldwide. Recruitment processes were rewritten. Background checks became invasive. Psychological profiling turned aggressive. Loyalty was no longer assumed. It had to be continuously proven. But these reforms came at a cost. Creativity declined. Initiative was punished. Fear replaced trust. The post-Philby intelligence world became safer in theory, but colder in practice. The cultural shift extended far beyond intelligence agencies. Governments began treating information itself as a controlled substance. classification expanded dramatically. Documents that once would have been shared among allies were now locked behind layers of secrecy. Even elected officials were sometimes denied access to intelligence deemed too sensitive. Democracy, built on transparency and accountability, quietly bent under the weight of fear. The shadow of betrayal reshaped not just espionage, but governance itself. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, Philby's story was quietly rewritten. Official narratives celebrated him as a hero of the state, a symbol of ideological victory over Western arrogance. Yet behind closed doors, his presence made others uneasy. He was living proof that infiltration worked, that loyalty could be faked for decades. This realization terrified Soviet officials as much as it impressed them. If the West could be infiltrated, so could they. Paranoia spread inward, consuming the very institutions Philby had helped protect. Philby spent his later years watching the world change faster than he could understand. The ideals that once motivated him began to erode. Corruption, repression, and economic stagnation within the Soviet system contradicted everything he had believed. The certainty of youth gave way to the ambiguity of age. Though he never publicly renounced his choices, those close to him described a man increasingly isolated, drinking heavily, and haunted by questions he could no longer answer. The collapse of the Soviet Union forced historians to confront an uncomfortable paradox. If Philby had succeeded so completely, why did the system he served ultimately fail? The answer lies in the limits of espionage. Intelligence can influence events, but it cannot sustain flawed systems forever. Philby helped secure Soviet dominance in Eastern Europe, but he could not prevent the economic and social pressures that would eventually tear the empire apart. His victories were real, but temporary, yet the world that emerged from the Cold War still bore his fingerprints. Borders established during that era remained. Military alliances hardened into permanent structures. Intelligence agencies retained their culture of secrecy and suspicion. The habits formed in response to betrayal became permanent features of global politics. Even when the original threat vanished, the mechanisms built to counter it endured. In the decades that followed, new forms of espionage emerged. Cyber warfare replaced coded telegrams. Whistleblowers replaced defectors. Data breaches replaced dead drops. And yet, the core lesson of Philby's life remained unchanged. Systems do not fail because they lack defenses. They fail because they misunderstand people. Trust, ambition, belief. These forces are impossible to fully control, yet they decide everything. Modern intelligence scandals often echo Philby's story. When massive leaks occur, the same questions resurface. How did this happen? Who failed? Why were the warnings ignored? Each time, investigations reveal familiar patterns. Assumptions left unchallenged, reputations protected, uncomfortable truths dismissed. Philby's ghost lingers not as a memory, but as a recurring mistake. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of his legacy is how quietly it operates. There is no single monument to Philby's influence, no official acknowledgement of how deeply he shaped the post-war world. His impact exists in absences, in operations that never succeeded, in alternatives that never materialized, in futures that were quietly erased before they could begin. History often frames global change as the result of great movements and powerful leaders. But Philby's life suggests another possibility, that the direction of the world can hinge on access rather than authority, on proximity rather than power, on the ability to sit at a table where decisions are made and remain unquestioned. As the 21st century unfolds, nations once again face uncertainty. Old alliances strain, new rivalries emerge. Information flows faster than control can keep up. In this environment, Philby's story feels less like history and more like a warning repeating itself. The conditions that allowed him to thrive, polarization, fear, ideological certainty, are not relics of the past. They are present once again. And so the forgotten spy continues to shape the world, not through new actions, but through lessons still being learned too slowly. His story reminds us that the most dangerous threats rarely announce themselves. They arrive dressed as allies. They speak the language of trust. And they wait, because history does not always change with a bang. Sometimes, it changes with a whisper. Philby's story also exposes the fragility of human institutions. Governments, no matter how powerful, are only as resilient as the people who operate within them. Structures, protocols, and technologies are meaningless without vigilance and critical thinking. Philby exploited the invisible cracks in these structures, not with force, but with understanding. He knew that systems tend to trust appearances, to reward conformity, and to overlook inconvenient truths. By becoming the perfect example of a loyal officer, he turned the system's strengths into vulnerabilities. In the decades following his defection, intelligence agencies around the world became obsessed with risk management. Training programs emphasized skepticism and verification over intuition. Every appointment, every clearance, and every promotion was scrutinized through the lens of potential betrayal. While this approach reduced the likelihood of a repeat Philby, it introduced a new problem. Paranoia became institutionalized. Analysts feared making bold recommendations. Diplomats hesitated to share information, and governments often acted slowly, constrained by their own suspicion. In trying to prevent betrayal, they became prisoners of their own protocols. Philby's influence also extended beyond espionage into the very culture of secrecy. The Cold War mindset, where information is power and trust is fragile, was transmitted across generations of intelligence officers. This culture persists even today. Modern intelligence operations, cyber warfare, and counterintelligence efforts still reflect lessons learned from the mistakes and successes of individuals like Philby. He demonstrated that an individual's understanding of human behavior can rival, or even surpass, technological advantage. At the same time, Philby's personal story remains tragic. Though he believed in his ideological mission, he paid a price for living a double life. Personal relationships were strained or destroyed, and genuine intimacy was often impossible. Every decision he made required a careful balance between loyalty to an idea and survival in a world of suspicion. In Moscow, he enjoyed a measure of recognition but remained isolated, constantly under surveillance, and never fully trusted. The spy who once manipulated the fate of nations was himself a prisoner of the system he had served. The moral ambiguity of Philby's life challenges simple notions of right and wrong. To the British, he was a traitor. To the Soviets, he was a hero. Yet neither label captures the complexity of his existence. Philby acted in accordance with his beliefs, yet the outcomes of his actions were unpredictable and far-reaching. History, in this sense, is less a ledger of deeds and more a reflection of consequences, many of which unfold long after the actors themselves have disappeared. Even as modern historians uncover more about Philby, much remains uncertain. Classified documents continue to be declassified, revealing new connections, operations, and patterns. Each discovery reshapes our understanding of how post-World War II geopolitics developed, showing the interplay of human decisions, chance, and deliberate manipulation. Philby's life, while singular, was also a window into a system that valued appearances over verification, ideology over pragmatism, and loyalty over accountability. The legacy of his actions persists in subtle ways. Intelligence failures continue to influence policy decisions. Distrust between allies often mirrors the suspicion sown by betrayals decades earlier. Cybersecurity breaches, leaks of classified information, and political espionage all carry echoes of the lessons learned during the early Cold War. Philby's story is therefore not only a historical case study, but also a guide to understanding the dynamics of modern global power struggles. Finally, Philby's life reminds us of the power of the unseen. History celebrates generals, presidents, and public figures, but often ignores those whose influence is exercised quietly, methodically, and invisibly. The fate of nations can pivot on knowledge controlled by a single individual, whose name may never be widely known. Philby was such a figure, and his story demonstrates that even when the world appears to be shaped by overt forces, invisible actors often have the greatest impact. The question his life leaves us with is profound. How much of the world is determined by visible events, and how much is shaped by shadows? Philby operated in the shadows, yet his influence was tangible, measurable, and enduring. And as long as information remains power, the lessons of his life will continue to resonate, reminding us that the most decisive actors are often those whom history forgets. As we reflect on Kim Philby's life, one truth becomes clear. History is rarely shaped by the obvious forces. Wars, treaties, and public leaders are only part of the story. Much of the world's fate is decided in rooms we never see, in files we may never read, and by individuals who operate in silence. Philby's life reminds us that power often lies not in titles or armies, but in knowledge, access, and patience. His choices influenced borders, governments, and the lives of millions, yet the man himself remained largely invisible, an architect of history working in the shadows. Philby's story is a cautionary tale about trust, ideology, and the fragility of institutions. It shows how a single individual, with conviction and opportunity, can reshape the course of global events. It also forces us to confront the complexity of morality. The line between hero and villain is not always clear, and consequences often outlast intentions. Philby believed he was serving a higher purpose, but the world he helped shape would challenge that belief in ways he could never have foreseen. As we conclude this journey into the hidden corridors of history, we are left with a haunting question. How many other Kim Philbys have there been? Individuals whose influence we will never fully understand, whose names may never appear in textbooks, yet whose decisions quietly altered the world. And what does that mean for the way we understand power, loyalty, and history itself? Now, we want to hear from you. What do you think? Was Kim Philby a hero of his ideology, or a villain who betrayed millions? Could one person truly change the world in secret, or was history bound to unfold this way regardless? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story fascinating and want to uncover more hidden truths from history, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. There are countless untold stories waiting to be revealed, and you won't want to miss a single one. History isn't just in books. It's alive, hidden, and sometimes in the shadows.